We have now experienced the fear that terrorism seeks to spread. But we have as a community, also responded with determination and resolve. Sunday morning, the presumed perpetrator lost his life in a shooting with the Danish police.
The Danish Prime Minister there not giving in to terror. Let's bring in our panel, syndicated columnist George Will, Charles Lane, opinion writer for the Washington Post, syndicated columnist Charles Krauthammer. George, I want to start with you. How could the White House put out a statement over the weekend, specifically on the other big terror issue with ISIS on the beaches of Libya, 21 Christians murdered, beheaded, and not mention that the victims were Christian, and not mention the perpetrators were Muslims?
Yes, what they said is they were Egyptian citizens. Wouldn't you love to be a fly on the wall in the room where the White House semanticists meet every morning to figure out how they could possibly describe what happened without offending those who did it? I think the phrase they should come up with is non-Islamic randomness. That would explain just about everything that they have to deal with. But it does, at this point, it's beyond burlesque. It's pathological, it's clinical, their inability and unwillingness to accurately describe things. The secret of decent, strong communication is specificity.
Charles?
The man got into the car and drove around the corner. The man got into a light gray Buick and drove around the corner, tells you more. Why can't they say specifically what happened?
There's a 3-day summit that starts tomorrow on violent extremism. There's already been a lot of chatter about why the White House won't call it a summit on Islamic extremism. You can touch on that if you like. But is this an opportunity for the president? We'll hear from the Vice President, Joe Biden, tomorrow. But is this an opportunity for the administration to reset and finally call it what it is?
Well, I guess it is. I'm not sure that they're going to view it that way or would take that opportunity. I just want to say that what we're seeing in Denmark, it fits into a wider pattern, obviously, that's already been in France, Belgium, a bunch of other countries, and has to be looked at together with what ISIS is doing in Libya. They're proclaiming that that's aimed at Rome. And then you have Putin pressuring from the east, and you have the potential economic problem about to strike Greece. The big picture, which I hope will be focused on by the administration, not in isolation as separate issues, is Europe is in a deep squeeze right now among these three forces: the economic problem, Putin's aggression, and the kind of corrosion of their own civil society by this hanging threat of Islamic terrorism. That is a big strategic challenge for the United States, and I think it has to be looked at that way.
George, you want to jump in quick?
Just note that Chuck just used a phrase the administration won't use, Putin's aggression. It's an ongoing incursion.
Oh, sorry. Good point.
Shape up.
Charles, language matter here?
Of course it does. It defines the conflict. I mean, Churchill saved England and civilization because in 1940 he was able to enlist the English language and he put it to work on behalf of civilization. What this administration is doing is precisely the opposite. It's sort of deconstructing any resistance with its refusal to acknowledge the obvious. And the obvious is this: it's not just Islamic radicalism anymore, or Islamic terrorism, which is only a tactic. This is really Islamist supremacy. And in that sense, it is akin to Nazism. That was racial supremacy, here it's Islamist. And the ideology of ISIS is clearly supremacist in the sense that anybody who is not Islamic, in their understanding, is to be either enslaved or eradicated. This is a genocidal movement.
You mentioned
you kill Christians, you kill Jews, you kill Yazidis, but you may, in certain circumstances, enslave them. That's what we are up against, and we have an administration that will not even admit that there's a religious basis underlying what's going on.
You mentioned Nazism. I want to play a bite from earlier today on our air. Walid Faris, who's a Middle East expert, he appears on Fox frequently. Here's what he said on that point.
This is genocidal in nature. They are threatening to kill more and more of these Christian Copts in Libya, but also possibly inside Egypt. So now we're seeing a different kind of jihadi genocidal action that we have not seen before.
George, jihadi genocidal action. That it's not just jihad anymore, there's also genocide going on.
Yes, Charles is quite right, and that gentleman is quite right. Ronald Reagan thought that the ethos of détente in the 1970s had involved semantic disarmament, that we were no longer able to talk clearly and crisply about what was going on. So he remoralized the Cold War by saying it was an evil empire and the focus of evil in the modern world. People were horrified, but he did it deliberately in order to say clarity matters here.
Charles, what about you? You talked about the stakes for Europe. Obviously, the stakes for the Middle East are enormous, the entire world. Think about Libya 4 years ago, the Arab Spring, and then the U.S. leading a coalition, working with the coalition at least, to take out Gaddafi. And now you see this terror spreading to the beaches of Libya as ISIS is expanding beyond Iraq and Syria.
Well, speaking of language, I think we got to stop using this phrase Arab Spring, because spring is a hopeful, nice thing that happens, and it's pretty clear that it hasn't played out that way. If there is a hopeful message or moment in what's going on, I would argue it is the response of certain Arab nations to the most outrageous attack. So we have Jordan responding with its own warplanes and potentially ground troops to the burning of its pilot, and now Egypt is striking against the ISIS people in Libya. And that's American hardware, I'd say, that's being put to a good use. We're talking about genocide, we're talking about Muslims versus everyone else. Let's not forget that these regimes or these governments that are striking back are also Muslim governments, and in fact, let us not forget that ISIS is killing a lot of Muslims too, including Shiites who to them are apostates. So it gets a little more complicated in that regard. But I think if there's anything hopeful to look at in this, it would be potentially the response of people in the region.
Their genocide, of course, includes Islamic apostates like the leaders of Jordan, like the leaders of Egypt. But in the end, it's not going to be Egypt or Jordan who carry the day. In the end, it's going to be the leadership of the United States, exactly as it was in the Cold War. Now, we have an administration that is truly pathological in its inability to actually state what's going on. In the video that was released that showed the savage beheading, it was addressed to the nations of the cross. It pledged itself to the conquest of Rome. When the Pope, who is not exactly a Christian militant, who isn't exactly a revanchist on behalf of Christ, says that these people were killed because they were Christian, and the administration says that the ones who were killed were Egyptian citizens, you've got a serious problem, and it's in this administration, and it is with the president.
George, speaking of the Pope, I remember President Obama holding up the Pope and his role in Cuba policy, and that was critical. Now, the Pope says this, and you're not hearing the same from the White House.
Well, pretty soon everyone in the world is going to be speaking in one way, and this administration is going to be speaking in another, and it just is going to become untenable. People will be counting and watching and laughing and making bets and making book around the water cooler as to when the first time they'll actually identify an orange as an orange.
We've been talking about the president being on defense over national security. Next up, are Republicans about to go on defense and take the fall for another government shutdown? Next.